This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
We bring you the latest on the new coronavirus outbreak as the WHO declares a global health emergency. African countries intensify screening, but how prepared are they to deal with the coronavirus? And the UN Security Council told foreign powers are still interfering in Libya and threatening proposed peace talks. Hello and welcome to Africa Live. As always, great to have you with us. I'm Richard Surulta, live in Nairobi. And for those of you joining us from across the continent and around the globe, we thank you for joining us. Let's take a look at other stories making headlines this hour. UK makes history as the first country to leave the European Union. And in sports, South Africa's Sharks gear up for their opener as the 2020 Super Rugby season kicks off. Once again, welcome to Africa Live. We start in China, where Chinese health officials say they are confident they can prevent and contain the spread of the coronavirus following a WHO decision to declare the disease a public health emergency of international concern. CGTN's Wu Shua has more.
The World Health Organization has labeled the outbreak of the new coronavirus a public health emergency of international concern. China's top health authority said on Friday that China has been taking the strictest control measures and is hoping the international community understands and supports China's control efforts. The authority also expressed confidence in controlling the epidemic.
The Chinese government has attached great importance to controlling the spread of the virus and has already adopted the most stringent measures to do so. We have the confidence and the ability to effectively contain and eliminate the virus. We hope the international community will understand and support our work. We look forward to working with other countries in conducting preventive measures so as to safeguard regional and global public health safety.
As the Spring Festival holiday winds down, people are returning to their homes. The government is mobilizing communities and villages to control the epidemic. As of the third quarter of 2019, China has 108,000 city communities and 540,000 villages. Major efforts will include registering everyone who comes back from Wuhan, doing door-to-door health checks, and urging to stay at home for self-quarantine. Some residential communities and villages have registration desks at their main entrances. And these communities are also asked to report the results of their monitoring every day. China has community-level clinics, and they are responsible for primary checkups for residents' health. Meanwhile, for patients recovering from the coronavirus, an expert from today's news conference says some still run the risk of getting infected again, so they're advised to watch out for getting a cold. Wu Guoxiu, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, for more analysis on the WHO decision, our reporter Xu Mengxi sat down with Professor Hu Xianlan, who served as a consultant for the WHO and the World Bank. Let's take a look.
Professor Hu, the latest decision by the WHO to declare the outbreak a public health emergency of international concern, what does it mean for China?
For China, I think China is a big country, should have some international responsibility. So we should treat this decision as a positive attitude. The purpose is to protect the weak health system control and also encourage the international scientists to do more research on the vaccine and also for the drugs. At the meantime, I think it's encourage every country should be aware of those diseases. I think like China, our experience is that early detection, early diagnosis, and early isolation and early treatment. So everyone in the area you think factor with disease should be wear the mask and also not join the mass gathering. So I think this is important experience.
Well, there have been growing fears that the coronavirus will spread into Africa. Africa is China's biggest trading partner, and there's a considerable number of Africans living in China. Some Africans have expressed a desire to return home as China struggles to contain the virus, while some countries have begun evacuating their citizens. Côte d'Ivoire's government says there is no need for this. It has instead committed to supporting its students while they remain in China, especially those in the city of Wuhan. A suspected case in Côte d'Ivoire last week tested negative for the virus. The 34-year-old student had traveled from Beijing to Abidjan over the weekend, showing flu-like symptoms.
This is a moment of solidarity to the people of China, a friendly and brotherly country. The Ivorian head of state and government gave spontaneous reactions since the outbreak of the virus. The head of state also issued instructions in order to assist the Ivorian people living in China, especially those who are at the epicenter of the crisis. I can even tell you that as an exception, the president gave instructions for adequate financial resources to reach the Ivorians to help them live since the Wuhan region has been placed under quarantine.
Meanwhile, a top UN official in Libya has raised concerns over continued violence in the country. This, he says, is despite the Berlin summit just 11 days ago, which set out a path to peace. CGTN's Sarah Walton reports.
Fighting in and around the Libyan capital of Tripoli has intensified in recent days, and the UN says a truce negotiated between the country's government of national accord and the opposing Libyan National Army earlier this month now exists only in name. On Thursday, the Security Council was told the conflict is escalating as both warring factions continue to receive military backing from foreign powers.
There are unscrupulous actors inside and outside Libya who cynically nod and wink towards efforts to promote peace and piously affirm their support for the UN. Meanwhile, they continue to double down on a military solution, raising the frightening specter of a full-scale conflict and further misery for the Libyan people.
There's been an increasingly chaotic struggle for power in Libya since NATO-backed forces overthrew former leader Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. A conference held in Berlin earlier this month to try to resolve the situation called for foreign powers to stop interfering in the conflict and respect an arms embargo. Salome told the Security Council that Turkey has now sent large numbers of fighters to support the GNA, the interim government. The UN says large containers have been seen arriving in Libya, believed to contain arms for the Libyan National Army. It reportedly has backing from several countries, including Egypt. The Security Council also raised concerns about the blockade of the country's oil industry. Forces loyal to the LNA have seized oil terminals, and reduced production is costing Libya $55 million a day, adding to the region's economic instability.
No group should be allowed to hijack Libya's national oil production. It is the Libyan people who suffer when the country's revenues collapse. The disruption of Libya's oil production has already caused electricity and water shortages. Shortages in fuel and cooking oil will likely soon follow. The current blockade on Libya's oil production must be lifted.
The UN is now trying to negotiate a meeting between the GNA and the LNA in Geneva. It says it's vital that the remains of the truce in Libya is fortified into a permanent ceasefire, as only then will it be possible for political reform and economic stabilization in the country. Sarah Walton, CGTN, New York.
Well, to South Africa now, where the fight against crime in Cape Town has received a major boost with at least 1,000 additional security personnel. With close to 4,000 people losing their lives in 2018 due to violent crime, the move aims to cut the murder rate by half, as CGTN's Travis Andrews reports.
It's no secret Cape Town has a major crime problem, which stems from systemic socio-economic problems. But a line has been drawn in the sand by the city, and they want to take back their streets. On the front line of that fight will be this new crop of Metro Police officers who are being tasked with keeping communities safe, which is not a simple job in this city, which has one of the highest murder rates in the country. But the city intends to put more boots on the ground.
We've recruited the 1,000 officers, and the first 500 now busy with their training. We can't dare want to send them into the streets, into the communities. They have identified the 10 worst crime-ridden areas, and then after that, the 15 worst crime-ridden areas, etc. So these guys and men and women officers will definitely deploy where they are most needed.
The officers are receiving additional training, which is meant to sharpen up their skills to operate in the theatre of crime prevention.
Busy with 3 months of training. The firearm component of that is the same training that SAPS gets. At the moment, what they're doing here is one of the additional elective components, which we do. It's a part of the street survival training.
The South African Army currently patrols some of Cape Town's most dangerous neighborhoods in an attempt to curb high crime levels, but the deployment will eventually end, leaving a huge gap for the officers to fill. In a city with such high levels of violent crime, the training being conducted here will not only prove invaluable when it comes to keeping the community safe, but also the officers themselves.
This particular component is around stop and approach. It's one of the most dangerous things staff can do on the street. Many of the officers who lost their lives in the line of duty did so under the circumstances of a stop and approach.
For now, though, these lots seem more than capable to take the fight to the criminals, as many see this not just as a job, but important civic duty and community calling. Travis Andrews, CGTN, Cape Town.
Well, we'll see you on the other side of the break. The news continues on Africa Live. Here's a look at the headlines. The UN warns of grave threats to food security and livelihoods in the Horn of Africa due to Locust invasion. And hundreds of South Sudanese youth turn away from conflict to begin reform journeys through job training.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to Africa Live. Let's give you our continued coverage of the coronavirus update. For more on this, we are going to join our colleague and our CGTN correspondent, Su Chinyuan, who is joining us live from Wuhan. Su Chinyuan, thank you for joining us here on Africa Live. Let's talk about this now. China is planning to send planes to bring back Chinese tourists stranded abroad. Tell us more about this plan and how it is expected to work.
Hello, Richard. Actually, we're on our way to Wuhan's airport. Chinese Civil Aviation Ministry has booked 2 flights today to bring back Wuhan travelers stranded overseas due to the outbreak. And the administration says the flight will take Wuhan's tourists from Thailand and Malaysia back home. They're scheduled to arrive in the airport in about 2 hours. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry said earlier this decision came after considering the situation and the issues the Chinese people are facing abroad. And many tourists from Hubei province, where the outbreak began, were reportedly denied boarding at some of the overseas airports. And many flights back to Wuhan have been cancelled too, leaving these people stranded in the other countries. Richard.
All right, Sun Chinyuan, I'd like you to talk to us about the reaction China is facing toward the WHO declaration of the outbreak as a global health emergency. What is the mood on the ground? Soon. Well, we'd like to apologize for that break in communication. It seems that we've lost Sun Chunyuan, our CGTN correspondent in Wuhan. Hopefully, we'll get him back later before the end of the bulletin. Moving on. Let's move to South Sudan now, where teenagers in Torrid Town are trading in their weapons for the chance to access training. The training is supported by the United Nations Development Program and the Netherlands. It is expected to enable young people support themselves and secure a brighter future for their families. CGTN's Brian Toussaint has this story.
These sewing machines may be a bit old-fashioned, but they are a lifeline for hundreds of young people in South Sudan's Torrid Town. The youth here are desperate for opportunities to learn new skills so that they can support themselves and their families. About 420 vulnerable and marginalized young people are enrolled at the Torrid Vocational Training Center. The center is supported by the UNDP and the Netherlands. The trainees here are taught tailoring, construction, and engineering.
Seeing at the sheer numbers of young people who have signed up for these trainings, they had to even go through selection process to be selected for these programs. And I also heard that some of the young people who were used to be part of armed groups have now given up their arms and joined the vocational training schools to find a positive way to contribute to the development of South Sudan. So I think this answers an urgent call.
Local authorities say projects like this will not only help individuals earn an income, but also support South Sudan's economic growth.
This is an opportunity of skill that will remain with you. You take to your homes. That will improve the livelihood of your family.
The UN Secretary General's Youth Envoy's visit to South Sudan is the organization's way of showing support in efforts to motivate young people to reach their full potential in life. The UN also wants to ensure that the youth in the country play an active role in the peace process. Young peace activists in Torrid Town are also urging political leaders to put their differences aside and form a new unity government as soon as possible.
We really need a government to be formed because the youth are suffering. We need other programs also to come so that the youth are given more skills, so that the youth are given empowerment, so that they will be able in long-term run to assess, to be having skills where they can enjoy their own lives.
South Sudan's President Salva Kiir and opposition leader Riek Machar have a February 22nd deadline to form a unity government after failing to reach an agreement despite two previous deadline extensions. Brian Toussaint, CGTN.
The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, has launched an innovative housing site in Niger. The initiative aims to address urgent and growing humanitarian needs in the Sahel region by providing displaced families with brick homes. CGTN's Wilkerson Yabwa has the details.
Niger's Walam town houses thousands of Malian refugees. Many of them fled their country at the start of an Islamist insurgency in 2012. Other refugees are from Nigeria, having fled their homes a few days ago due to frequent attacks by Islamist militias. The proposed United Nations housing project aims to develop long-term solutions for refugees and vulnerable citizens of Niger.
We must provide humanitarian aid. People who are displaced always have urgent need of food, medicine, shelter, sanitation, and more. We need to think about the long term and give people autonomy. This leads to a more dignified life, a better life in the long term.
And with the support from the government of Niger and financing from the German Agency for International Cooperation, UNHCR plans to build 4,000 durable homes in urban sites. The project will serve refugees and vulnerable families from host communities. Families will receive ownership deeds for the homes, which sit on land donated by the government. The urbanization project is also a livelihood initiative, as workers from both refugee and host communities are being trained to make the bricks, which themselves are highly energy efficient and require less cement than traditional bricks.
Having this house is going to help make my tasks easier. It will help our family stay safe during the rainy season. During the rainy seasons, we usually have to rebuild our shelters and the wooden stakes. You can't even compare that with these new brick houses.
The model is to integrate, or rather include, refugee communities into local communities. And here, because of the complication of internal displacement, internally displaced people are also included. And this is why we're here. We're here to inaugurate houses that are given to both refugees and locals and nationals, fostering also social cohesion between different groups, which works very well here.
About 60,000 Malian refugees live in Niger. Many live in camps near the country's borders. But as the area becomes increasingly roiled by insecurity, UNHCR has started developing out-of-camp solutions in areas where they can access education, health services, and economic opportunities. Bulkisanyabwa, CGTN.
Well, most of history's refugees have been the product of conflicts. But lately, more people are being forced to leave their homes due to sudden or long-term changes to the local environment. Scientists say environmental disasters cannot be ignored as one of the direct causes of displacement.
The fast drought in Ethiopia's Oromia region destroyed crops and animals. After gunmen from a rival group killed thousands, many like Asha fled into the mountains. They marched for days until they reached a safe village.
Because of the drought, even before the conflict happened and we got displaced, we used to have 1 meal a day, only 1 meal.
Scientists say Asha's story will become more common around the world as repeated disasters fuel conflicts over ever scarcer resources. More and more people are recognizing the link between violence and climate change.
They make the relation that the shrinking livelihoods, the struggle over less productive land is at the origin of much of what they suffer after a couple of years of experiencing drought, for instance. Then they experience violence.
According to one monitoring center, Ethiopia had the highest number of new internally displaced people in 2018, some fleeing droughts or floods and clashes. The United Nations says the world needs to prepare for millions more climate change refugees. The World Meteorological Organization has warned more extreme weather events if carbon dioxide emissions keep rising at the current rate. Chambono, CGTN.
The plague of desert locusts is threatening agricultural production and livestock in Africa. Ethiopia, Kenya, and Somalia are currently the most affected countries. They heavily depend on agriculture, but the risk to South Sudan and Uganda is growing.
The swarms of locusts are spreading fast. It is feared that they can potentially eat as much food in one day as 35,000 people could.
We depend a lot on this season, and we worry that the locusts will destroy our harvest and will end up remaining hungry through the rest of the year, waiting for October for the next cropping season.
For now, Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia have been the main countries that have been infested by desert locusts in billions. But then there are also other countries at risk, especially South Sudan, Uganda, Eritrea, which is also infested so far.
In all the three countries, control operations are in progress to try and mitigate the problem. But their capacities are stretched to the limit and have no recent experience in addressing the issue.
We are in a region where over 11 million people in the three countries are already in acute food insecurity. Therefore, we need to make all possible effort to avoid such a deterioration. We know that these locusts, the locusts that we see here, can create really massive devastation, not only in terms of crop, but also in terms of pasture, and therefore affecting the livelihoods of the pastoralist communities.
There also remains a high risk of a new generation of swarms which could start to form in February. If control operations are not scaled up rapidly, the locusts could expand and spread to South Sudan and Uganda. Past locust upsurges in the Horn of Africa and the Sahel caused widespread losses at the regional and household levels. Chamgono, CGTN.
Welcome back. Let's bring you an update in our continuing coverage of the coronavirus outbreak. Just a short while ago, we spoke to Raphael Uhuru Nyaruoba, a Kenyan microbiology research fellow at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
I was a current student studying at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, doing my master's in microbiology. Right? So when the outbreak came about, so because I've been trained to do this type of work like molecular detection work and virus control, so we were asked to help in the situation. So what we basically do is we get samples from the hospitals, multiple samples, and help in the extraction and detection of cases. However, this being a research institute, there is a lot of work being done. Some teams are working on development of the vaccine, some teams are working on drugs, some teams are working on characterizing the virus. There was a recent publication online that from one of the groups in this institute that showed the virus genome, so that other scientists can use this to help create drugs and antivirals. So I also do part of the work, like helping in detection, helping in quantification of the viral amount to come up with some solutions. Because Wuhan Institute of Virology is a national biosafety laboratory, right? So to make sure that we are safe when we are working with this virus, we annually have biosafety training on how to handle ourselves with different pathogens. So like this virus is a high-level pathogen. So we make sure we wear the appropriate gowns for handling the virus. We use the appropriate masks, the 3M masks, the full hood, everything that pertains to handling this virus. And before we go in as a team. We don't work singly, so that one person can take care of the other person in case we are working and there's an emergency of some sort. And we check each other's dressing. And so we take every general precaution to keep ourselves safe when we are handling the virus.
And we're not done just yet. We've got your business news coming up after the break. Here's a sneak peek at the headlines. The UK makes history as the first country to leave the European Union. And the IMF warned South Africa against delays on vital economic reforms.
Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and global business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Well, the 3.5 years of Brexit struggle is finally over. Although a few other dates have come and gone, the UK will become the first ever country to leave the European Union. And this will happen this Friday at 2300 GMT. However, that doesn't mean that things will change overnight. CGTN's Richard Bestick explains why.
The clock really is now ticking down on those moments before Britain departs the European Union after 40 years of membership. It really has been a crazy 3.5 years since the referendum in 2016. largely driven by slogans. We've had Brexit means Brexit. We've had a soft Brexit, a hard Brexit, and one Prime Minister even tried to give us a red, white and blue Brexit. The Labour opposition in Britain was selling a jobs first Brexit. But then in the general election, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson came up with the idea of let's get Brexit done. And for a population weary of 3 years of battling over Brexit, it resonated. And he won what he called a stonking majority in Parliament. It gave him the powers to force through Brexit, and Britain now will be leaving. We know that for sure. The European Union's Parliament played its part endorsing Boris Johnson's legislation, giving their backing to Britain's departure from the European Union, and then bursting into song. There was waving of scarves with United Forever, and speeches saying that if Britain ever changed its mind, it would be welcome back into the European fold. Not quite sure how sincere that gesture was. The Brexit Party, which ironically has held seats in the European Parliament in one guise or another for more than 20 years, hurled one last insult at the European Union, saying, "We hate you." They waved Union Jack flags and then left the chamber of the European Parliament en masse. But here's the thing. However much Boris Johnson argues that he's getting Brexit done, the reality is that in the year ahead lie the most difficult negotiations, forming Britain's future relationship with that giant trading bloc on its doorstep and its 500 million consumers. That will be the difficult bit. Some say it'll make the last 3.5 years look easy. Richard Bestick, CGTN, London.
In the meantime, the Bank of England has held interest rates following Governor Mark Carney's final monetary policy meeting. The sterling jumped by about 0.5% against the dollar to trade at around $1.3. This after the central bank's monetary policy committee voted to keep the base rate at 0.75%. Recent weak economic figures had led several members to mull a rate cut. But with January data showing an uptick in confidence and activity following the December 12 general elections, expectations of an imminent cut had dampened. The latest BOE decision comes at a crucial time for the British economy, with the UK set to exit the European Union.
Overall, UK activity likely stagnated in the final quarter of 2019, leaving the economy operating with a margin of excess supply. In parallel, CPI inflation fell below the MPC's 2% target, reaching 1.4% in the fourth quarter. While this weakness largely reflects energy prices, core inflation has also slowed, and domestically generated inflation pressures outside the labor market remain contained. So the question facing the MPC at this meeting was whether the new decade would start with a bang. Certainly, political developments have been significant, leading to the UK's historic withdrawal from the European Union tomorrow evening.
And we are now joined by Naweed Jarbakale in London for the latest. Naweed, thank you for joining us here on Africa Live. Thanks for taking time out to talk to us. Well, it's just hours before the UK will no longer be part of the EU. What is the sense you're getting of the general mood of the people in the UK at the moment, Naweed?
Yeah, just over 12 hours to go until Britain leaves the European Union at 11 p.m. GMT this evening. And the sense you get here is people are really just getting on with their days. But this is going to be a historic day. The 31st of January 2020 will be remembered in the history books as the day Britain left the European Union after 47 years of membership. In terms of why this matters, it is still a dividing issue. 17 million people voted in that referendum in 2016 to leave the European Union. 16 million roughly roughly voted to stay in Europe. And that's why we've seen the political wrangling and the divisions that have really become entrenched in the past few years here in the UK. And that's going to be the key challenge, I think, for Boris Johnson, domestically at least, is how does he try and unify this country, especially when those divisions, even though Brexit is going to happen tonight, those divisions definitely remain here on the streets and around the UK as well.
Well, now, historic indeed. Brexit happens in just a few hours, and yet there is still talk about uncertainty. What concerns do businesses have, or what are the outstanding concerns that people in the UK feel have not been adequately addressed yet? Now, talk to us about that.
Yeah, definitely lots of concerns. In terms of ordinary people, the transition period that Britain formally enters as soon as 11 p.m. GMT happens, we have a transition period of 11 months until the end of this year, where things roughly stay the same. Not too much impact on people, but businesses, that's where the real impact is. There's still a lot of uncertainty for businesses about what comes after that. So the 11-month period, Boris Johnson has set himself a deadline to try and thrash out a deal with the European Union, which he says can be done, despite most experts and analysts saying it's too optimistic. But for businesses, many of them that I've been speaking to up and down the country say actually what comes after that. So we leave the customs union, the single market at the end of this year. What does that mean for our businesses? How do I prepare for something which is still unknown? The Prime Minister's spokesman, it's something I put to him earlier this week, and he said, well, there shouldn't be any uncertainty. We're coming out of the customs union at the end of the year. But really, that's not a good enough answer for many businesses around the country. So even though Brexit's happening, there are still lots of questions left to be answered.
Now, let's unpack that a little more. Prime Minister Boris Johnson hosted African leaders recently in London. Apart from government, how are businesses, as you've mentioned, looking at the prospects of perhaps trade with Africa outside EU regulations?
Yeah, this was one of the key arguments for Brexit. Supporters of Brexit said once we leave the European Union, we'll take off the shackles and be able to strike trade deals with countries all over the world. And Africa really is a focus for Boris Johnson, particularly when it comes to trade. We saw him roll out the red carpets for leaders from Egypt to Uganda, from various African countries here just over a week ago for the Africa Investment Summit. And if you look at what's going to happen next, it is going to be a challenge for the UK to try and boost its trade with Africa. If you look at the statistics from the International Trade Centre, exports from the other 27 EU states, so exports from the EU totaled $170 billion in 2018 to Africa. The UK's exports, just $12 billion. And this is the big difference. Once Brexit happens, the UK will have to also compete with the European Union, and at the moment the Europeans are much, much further ahead. Places like Portugal, places like France, places like Germany definitely doing more trade with Africa at the moment, but that is something that the UK wants to change. Liz Truss, the International Business Secretary, said that they wanted to try and boost trade with Africa, but it may take some time for them to catch up with the rest of Europe.
All right, now, my final question to you. Speaking of what's going to happen next, what is expected for this next phase of a trade deal being reached between the UK and the EU?
Yeah, this really is the key question here in political circles in Westminster and in Brussels as well. 3.5 years of political wrangling, one deadline just about to finish, and already Boris Johnson has set the clock ticking on another one. By the end of this year, 11 months, he says he wants to get a trade deal signed, sealed and delivered, wrapped up in time for the end of the year. The European Union says that's too optimistic. Experts and economists, most of them say that's too optimistic as well, because if you look at another country like Canada, there's talk of a Canada-style deal being struck with the EU for the UK. That took 7 years to negotiate. The UK is the first member to leave the European Union after almost 5 decades, so there's lots of regulation to try and get through, lots of labour rights, lots of issues around fishing waters. Boris Johnson's confident he can do it in 11 months. It's going to be a real test, alongside, by the way, other trade deals. So once Britain comes out of the European Union tonight, he'll start talking to the United States, to Japan, to African countries, and possibly China as well. So alongside all of that and 11 months, it's going to be a very tough ask. Back to you.
Nawid Jarbakel, thank you so much for breaking it down for us. That's Nawid Jarbakel speaking to us live from London. Moving on, the International Monetary Fund has urged the South African government to speed up reforms to revive the economy. This week, the lender published the outcome of its consultations with the government and other authorities. It based the findings on the assumption that partial reform implementation and continued governance would lift South Africa's business confidence. However, while the IMF forecasts South Africa to grow from 0.4% in 2019 to 0.8% this year, the international financier has warned that per capita growth will continue to contract in the near term. This is after Africa's most industrialized economy recorded its 5th consecutive decline in 2019. A top UN official has warned that the international community would pay a terrible price if it fails to help rebuild Sudan's dilapidated economy. According to the United Nations Development Program Administrator, it is up to the Sudanese people to decide what kind of society they want. Achim Steiner, however, says Sudan will need the help from the international community to build that society. Months after the ouster of longtime ruler Omar al-Bashir last April, Sudan is at the moment in the midst of a series of challenges driven by an economic crisis. This includes foreign debt of more than $60 billion, inflation at about 60%, soaring unemployment rates, as well as a chronic shortage of fuel and foreign currency.
The story of Sudan in the year 2020 is not the story of the previous government. It is a story in which waiting for too long to actually step in and support this process may have a terrible price to pay. Our role, that of the World Bank, the IMF, organizations that have studied this in many different countries, we have to come up with wiser and smarter advice than simply saying to Sudan, well, you are failing in your reform if you don't do X or Y. Here is a country in which the youth, and particularly the women, have not only managed to pull off a peaceful revolution in large part, but they actually have an agenda to build a developmental state. The international community must recognize how unusual and how extraordinarily helpful this is in a region that otherwise is providing more and more worrying news about political stability, about extremism.
Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt are yet to reach an agreement over the operation of a dam that Ethiopia is constructing on the River Nile. The three countries have been meeting in Washington, D.C. for several days to try and finalize an agreement. CGTN's Coletta Wanjohi reports from Addis Ababa.
For the past 3 days, lawyers, experts, ministers from Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia have been having talks in Washington, D.C. The U.S. government and the World Bank are attending as observers. They are seeking to create a legal framework on the filling and operation of the 6,000 megawatts Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam that Ethiopia began constructing on the River Nile in 2011. Earlier this month, they agreed that filling of the dam reservoirs be done between July and August, Ethiopia's rainy season. Their current discussions are being guided by a draft that was produced in the Sudanese capital Khartoum about a week ago when technical experts from the three countries met. It entails issues like the water filling stages of the dam, water retention in the dam, operation of the water reservoirs, and how to manage drought conditions. The dam will reduce floods in Sudan, but Egypt remains concerned that the operation of the dam will severely affect the flow of water downstream to its territory. If they fail to agree, they will invoke external mediation. This is according to a declaration of principles that the three countries signed in 2015. Ethiopia has already expressed interest in having an African mediator if it gets to that stage. Coletta Wanjohi, CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
And the news continues on Africa Live. We've got a lot more wonderful and amazing stories coming your way. Here's a look at what's ahead. And going bald, we look at why more Nigerian women are taking the bold step to shave all their hair.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival, and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. In Nigeria, more women are taking to the barber's chair, growing bolder and balder. This new trend is fast gaining traction among women of all ages and across various walks of life. CGTN's Kelechi Mekalam has more.
Juliet is a student who works part-time as a waitress. She's come here to touch up her haircut. It's a bi-monthly routine for the mother of one who's been wearing her hair short for over a year.
I just wanted a new look. I wanted to be different from every other girl on the streets wearing the extension. Like right now, I'm cool with this look. I'm okay. Every day new things are coming up, so I believe this is a new trend and I want to go with it.
Unlike Juliet, who's got a knack for trending styles, there are others like makeup artist Ginika Okoro, who finds it a convenient alternative for her busy lifestyle.
I think you just want to feel free. It's a way of expressing yourself, it's a way of showing freedom. You could at least just go into the bathroom and you don't need to look for a shower cap. I can't remember when last I looked for a shower cap.
More and more women like Juliet and Ginika are embracing the bolder look, and where the need arises, they could use a wig to switch up their looks. It's a total shift from an age-long tradition in Nigeria where women are required to shave their hair when they're bereaved. According to recent estimates, Nigeria's hair industry alone is worth over $7 billion annually. The figures are predicted to rise by at least 8%, and the coming of the bolder look is an addition to this growing market. Now more barbers are specializing in women's haircuts, and that's because it turns out more profitable. So depending on the style, treatment and aftercare, a female haircut could cost up to 5 times more than their male counterparts.
I make more money when I cut women's hair than men hair, because of when you cut women's hair with everything they will do, cost more money.
So from daring mohawks to tinted punks and to the ultimate clean shaves, more women are rocking their bold and bald looks. Kelechi Mekalam, CGTN Abuja, Nigeria.
Guess what? We've got your sports news coming up after the break. Don't go away. Here's a look at the headline. South Africa's Sharks gear up for their opener as the 2020 Super Rugby season kicks off.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? Sports Scene. Find your game.
And let's talk a bit of rugby. The Super Rugby season kicked off earlier on Friday and has already been generating huge excitement following South Africa's World Cup triumph in Japan. Now the focus is on each franchise doing their utmost to keep the Rainbow Nation's reputation intact against the best Australasia's and Argentina have to offer, beginning with a team who knows all about reaching the finals. CGTN's Sias Duplessis has more from Durban.
The Sharks head into the new Super Rugby season full of excitement and promise. It is a young team, a new coach, and led by a World Cup winner. The expectations are high, and the onus is on the team to live up to those expectations.
There are a lot of players that are involved in the World Cup, that are back at their franchises, and they'll definitely bring confidence, in players, within their teams. And I think as South African, there's also a responsibility, it's number one in the world, and I think we need to uplift that and live that standard. Looking forward to this 2020 season.
Sean Everett, a man who has been involved with the Sharks since 2014 as an assistant coach, now takes over the reins. And the new head coach is eager for his charges to make their mark on the competition.
I think every weekend is a challenge, as we know. No one can get ahead of themselves. The challenge never disappears. You know, if you're off your game on a weekend, you can get a hammering, regardless of whether you're at home or away, and I've experienced that. So to get the youngsters to understand that mental preparation on a weekly basis, you know, needs to be consistent, and they can't drop the ball.
Who welcomes the extra responsibility of captaincy, believes the team can challenge for the title and have worked their socks off to get ready for the Southern Hemisphere's toughest rugby competition.
I feel we've been a team that always fought for playoffs, you know, but unfortunately we never, you know, got that edge to make it through to the finals. But this season we don't want to put much pressure on ourselves, but we've worked pretty hard on our defense, worked pretty hard on our attack. I hope that gels, you know, quite well, and I hope as a group we try, you know, and go all the way.
The Durban-based Sharks are one of South Africa's most successful teams, appearing in 4 Super Rugby finals. But their last appearance came in 2012, and since then the men in black have failed to meet the expectations of their loyal black and white army of fans. This year, with a World Cup victory still fresh in their memories, the Sharks will be hoping the triumph in Japan rubs off on their quest to reach their 5th final. CS Duplessis, CGTN, Durban.